Okay. All right, folks. So the broadcast is starting, so we can begin the class. This is the second class we're doing in the perception image. And just to remind everybody, remember that one of the things that that Deleuze is doing in his book is developing what he calls a typology of images in relation to cinema. And we'll see later on that he relies upon the work of the American pragmatist philosopher Peirce to guide him in this process. But the central topic of both volumes of cinema is the time image, namely the way in which cinema conveys time and deals with the complexities of time. And remember that the work is broken up into two volumes. The first volume is the indirect time image, and that is where his discussion of the motion image takes place. And the motion image itself is broken up into three sub-images, if you want to put it that way. One is the perception image, the affection image or the emotion image, and the action image. And then we'll see in the second volume, we leave the indirect image of time and enter into a new phase in the history of cinema with the development of post-World War II European film, in which the time image is direct rather than indirect. And so this is the basic structure of Deleuze's project. And so we talked about the perception image last week, and we're going to be continuing with that discussion this week. James says he has to leave early at 7. That's fine, James, no problem. Okay, so I hope everybody is well, and we can get started. What I would like to do is, we began talking about montage last time. And if you remember, according to Deleuze, there are two primary approaches to creating the motion image. And one has to do with camera movement, and the other with montage. And montage is a technique that was developed really by American filmmakers, and here D.W. Griffith is centrally important. But it was then conveyed very quickly to the Soviet avant-garde. Cinematography, movie making in general in the Soviet Union in the 1920s was probably the most vital school of filmmaking in the world. It didn't last very long. It lasted about 20 years. And what put an end to this, about 10 years, and what put an end to the Soviet experimentation was the rise of Stalin and the repression of experimentation in the arts and a free expression in the arts in general. So there was a window of about 10 years between the beginning of the revolution. The revolution was in 1917, and then the Civil War was fought. And it was during the Civil War that Soviet filmmaking began. And so in the 10 years from 1920 to 1930, that's the period of great creativity in Soviet film. And that's when montage is developed far beyond where it was in Griffith's work. But we need to discuss what Deleuze refers to as the Soviet school and the relation between the revolutionary impulse in Soviet filmmaking and montage as a technique. And I thought the best way of doing this would be to begin with something that's probably been more studied, a sequence of film that has been more widely studied in film classes than anything else that's ever been made, and that is the very famous Odessa Steppe sequence from Eisenstein's film Battleship Potemkin. Let me just contextualize this a little bit. Battleship Potemkin refers to a naval mutiny that occurred in 1905. There were two revolutions in Russia. Actually, there were three. There was the 1905 revolution, which was precipitated by worker strikes in the cities, and then also by mutinies and rebellions within the armed forces. And the Battleship Potemkin played a major role in those mutinies. Then in 1917, in February of 1917, there was a revolution that overthrew the Tsar and brought to power Alexander Kerensky, who was a sort of a liberal, moderate liberal. And then, but Kerensky was determined to keep Russia in the First World War. There was hunger. The army began collapsing on the front. And then the third wave of revolution took place in Russia, and that was the 1917 October Revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power. Now, Eisenstein was a filmmaker under the early Bolshevik regime, and the year was 1925. In other words, 2 decades after the 1905 revolution. And so the Soviet Film Agency decided to sponsor movies commemorating the 1905 revolution, given its 20th anniversary. And Eisenstein made a film called Battleship Potemkin, in which he depicts the mutiny of the Potemkin during the 1905 revolution. Now, Eisenstein, just to give you a little more context, was probably the most significant theorist of montage in the history of filmmaking. He wrote voluminously about it, and he wrote brilliantly about it. And so in Eisenstein, what we have is a perfect exemplification of Deleuze's claim that filmmakers think that they're not simply great filmmakers, that they're not simply shooting movies on the cuff. In other words, that they develop a system of thoughts in the process of movie making. Eisenstein began as a visual artist, and then during the Civil War that followed the 1917 October Revolution, he entered into the Red Army. He was an artist attached to the Red Army, and as he began traveling in what were then called agitprop trains. Agitprop is short for agitation and propaganda. The Soviet regime sent such trains out throughout Russia during the Civil War period to reach people in the countryside and also to cover battles during the Civil War. And so there were 2 filmmakers, famously, who were members of the agitprop crews. One was Eisenstein, and the other was Vertov, whose work we're also going to be talking about in depth today. You know, I asked people to watch Man with a Movie Camera. Okay, so what happened was it was on the trains that both Eisenstein and Vertov began to develop an interest in film as a method of educating, propagandizing, agitating the Soviet masses, the vast majority of whom were rural, were peasants. And so they began their interest in that kind of aesthetic production. And it was, once the Civil War was over with, Eisenstein was not a filmmaker on the agitprop trains, he was a painter. Vertov was a filmmaker right from the very beginning. He made movies in the agitprop trains. And actually, he sent the footage back to Moscow, where it was edited and shown in Russian film theaters as newsreel footage. And so Vertov can really claim more than any other person in the world, any other filmmaker in the world, to having been the inventor of the newsreel, which is the way people got their news, prior to the development of television. Right? It became quite common to watch a newsreel in a movie theater before the main feature came on. And the Russians found Vertov's work very exciting. And he reached a great number of people. But Eisenstein, at the same time, was working as a painter. And then when the Civil War was over with, he became a theatrical director. And he worked through an organization of communist artists who were independent of the regime, of the Soviet regime. They weren't formally incorporated into it, but they were nonetheless dedicated to making work that was in support of the Russian Revolution, and they were called the Prolet Cult group, Prolet Cult. And Prolet Cult had a theater which Eisenstein directed. It was in the process of directing that he began to develop theories of montage. And when he then decided that he could no longer go further with those theories in the living theater, he switched to cinema. And that's how Eisenstein became a filmmaker. One of his central theories was that he expressed it actually under the category of what he called a montage of attractions. A montage of attractions. And remember, montage splits up a story or a film sequence into its parts, into discrete segments, and then mixes those segments in such a way as to create particular kinds of effects of transition. Now, we saw that with D.W. Griffith's film, Intolerance. Griffith does this in a classical form, which is he called parallel montage. He has montage elements that tell the story of tells four separate stories along four separate historical timelines. At the very end of the film, we see the parallel montage converging in a chase scene that occurs in the present, a chase scene involving a car and a train, but then there is a parallel montage that harks back to a chariot race in ancient Babylon. Well, even before he became a filmmaker, Eisenstein adapted montage techniques to living theater. And it's possible to also present theater in segments and to create jarring effects and so forth. And the primary purpose of what I'm referring to as the jarring effect or the shock was to create an emotional state in the film audience, or in the theater audience in this case. What Eisenstein wanted to do was to wrench people out of their normal way of being conscious of the world and to create a heightened emotional state which ultimately would lead, in his view, to a deepened commitment to the very difficult revolutionary process that was going on in the Soviet Union. So let me give you an example, one example of the montage of attractions in theater. There's a play that Eisenstein directed. Actually, the name is escaping me. But the montage of attractions, or one of the techniques of attractions, consisted in the following. Before people came and took their places in the theater, the stagehands placed firecrackers under everyone's seat. And so at an appropriate point in the development of the movie, someone backstage presses a button, and there's an explosion that occurs under every seat in the theater audience. You know, the idea of a montage of attractions was also linked to the conception that the primary role of theater in a film in a revolutionary period is that of propaganda and agitation. Agitation literally in the sense of stirring up the audience, evoking a deepened commitment to the historical process that Russia was going through and so forth. There was never any sense that propaganda and agitation were less than respectable. And even in the United States, the words propaganda and agitation, where they were associated with the left wing, there was no doubt about that. But there was never the connotation of brainwashing or even of external manipulation, although the technique clearly was manipulative, that the word propaganda then came to have in the following period. But in any event, Battleship Potemkin uses the montage of attractions, but it does it specifically in cinematic terms. And of course, because cinema is quite different than live theater, it offers opportunities for montage that theater does not. So we know that, for example, the film is put together in an editing studio. There's no editing studio in live theater. So various kinds of film footage are shot. The pieces are cut up into segments and constructed and put together in various ways in the editing studio. So the opportunities for montage, the opportunities to put film segments together in ways that create specific effects are far more extensive in cinema than in theater. Okay, the Battleship Potemkin, once again, is about the 1905 revolution. The mutiny of the crew of the Battleship Potemkin. In the Odessa Steppes sequence, the mutiny has already occurred. The crew has taken over the ship and executed the officers. There's early in the film where we see how brutal the regime is on the ship. And this is indicative of the brutality of the Russian military in general. The officer corps was a part of the traditional aristocracy. And the sailors, of course, were either peasants or workers. And so there was an element of class domination in the military, which is depicted very, very dramatically in Battleship Potemkin, especially around a huge slab of meat that is being served to the sailors. And the meat is crawling with maggots. The camera does a close-up of the meat, and we see the maggots crawling in the body of the slab of beef, the side of beef. The sailors object to having to eat this rancid, insect-infested, parasite-infected meat, but the ship's surgeon comes over and certifies the meat as being perfectly fine, perfectly healthy. And in this tension about whether or not the sailors are going to eat the meat, we have the beginnings of the mutiny and the beginnings of the takeover of the ship. So the ship has been taken over, and it sails, or it moves. It's whatever the word is for a ship without sails. It motors into the town of Odessa. And it does so in order to bury one of the sailors who was a leader of the rebellion and who was shot by one of the officers during the rebellion. And so the Battleship Potemkin is stationed just off the coast of Odessa. They've buried their comrade, and the crew is back on the ship. There is a workers' strike in Odessa, as there was in many of the Russian cities at this period of time. And when the scene opens, you'll see it in a second, when the scene opens, the Odessa Steppe sequence opens, Eisenstein shows the people of Odessa in a very excited way, greeting the ship, greeting the Battleship Potemkin, and bringing food out to the sailors and so forth. So this is the way the scene begins, and we'll watch it here. As I said, this is one of the classic, actually it's the classic example of Soviet montage. Hopefully this will work. Hold on a second. Okay. Do people see the Odessa the Odessa staircase on screen? Mac, do you see that? James, you don't see it either? Let's see if I can get that to work. It should work.
Got the audio.
I take it that you're not seeing it?
Just the audio.
Just the audio.
That's probably through your mic, I guess.
Yeah, why in the world are you not seeing it? Let me see here. Let me see if I can, let me do the following. I'm going to put it on my desktop on a different screen and then switch to screen sharing. What you'll get then is the visual stuff, but not the sound. But that's perfectly fine. The film was a silent film, and the sound has been added subsequently to the filmmaking. When this was originally shown in movie theaters, there would be a piano player in the theater playing a particular piece of music, but the music is insignificant, really. We're talking about a silent film with a text. So let me call up another web page. Hold on a second. Another part of my browser, and go to YouTube on that. Okay, let me get to Battleship Potemkin, Odessa Steppes. And let's see here. Should have Odessa Steppes. Okay. And let me put this up. Give that a shot. Okay. Now let me try to switch to desktop view on Google Hangouts. Where are we here? showcase. Nope, that's not it. Just show the desktop. Screen share for Hangouts. Select the video to show. Okay, here we go. Now, can you see that? Can you see the YouTube screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. So let me show the film on YouTube here in this fashion, and I'm going to mute it because I don't think the sound will come out very well, or at least I'll turn down the sound. But let's watch it in this fashion. Okay. Here goes.
It's not playing.
Say it again?
It's not playing.
It's not playing. Okay. It's playing on my screen, but you're not getting it, huh?
No, sir.
All righty. Sorry about that, folks. We'll have to forget about watching the Odessa step sequence, I guess. Unfortunately, the YouTube on Google On Air. Sorry about that. Well, let me rejoin you in chat. And blah, 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 blah. Hold on a second. Here we go. I'm back to you. Yeah, I'm sorry. The technology, as I said, is dicey, and we're trying to push it to the limits. Let me put on chat again. It's not playing, just a still shot of the desktop. Oh, okay. Now, what Pixels is suggesting is that I give you the link to Battleship Potemkin, but the problem then is that this is streaming into YouTube. So if I give you the link and we all watch it separately, all we're going to get is a 12-minute blank screen on YouTube. And so what I would rather do is just talk about it. You can watch the sequence afterwards and see what's going on in there. But I wanted to do this by way of illustration of Deleuze's discussion of Soviet montage. Remember that he contrasts Soviet montage with, you can watch it in another tab. Well, that's true. All right, let me give you the link to the YouTube version of Battleship Potemkin. Hold on, I got rid of it, so I'll have to call it up again. New window. Hold on one second. History. Okay. Battleship Potemkin. All right. Hold on. Edit. Copy. Okay. And okay. So this is the link to the Battleship Potemkin's Odessa step sequence. And so if you want to watch it, just click on that. And I just ask you to turn your volume off so that it doesn't interfere with what I'm saying. Okay. So if you decide to watch it while I'm talking about the sequence, that's perfectly fine. But turn your volume off. All right. Okay. Eisenstein contrasts Soviet montage with American montage. And the primary figure in American montage is D.W. Griffith. Although he also tells us that montage is a general technique that many filmmakers are using in the United States during the period in which Griffith is filming, even though it reaches a height of development in Griffith's work. American montage is what Deleuze refers to as organic. And it's organic in that the various elements of the montage, as I talked about it last week, they fit together like the halves of an apple. It's as though you had cleft an apple in two, and each of the two segments is a separate stream of montage images, but the two fit together in an integral organic form. In parallel montage, especially the chase sequence in Intolerance, in Griffith's film Intolerance, is a perfect example. But also the entire film, Intolerance, is about relations down through the ages in which those in power are intolerant of those out of power. And so we get the idea in Griffith's work that the relation between rich and poor is, as Jesus once said, always with us, right? The poor you always have with us. And so there's an articulation of elements, and the purpose of montage is to make those elements explicit. But the elements are conceived of as organic, but as also invariable. Society split into the rich and the poor, and the rich oppress the poor. And this is something that happens in ancient Babylon. It's something that happens under the French regime in the 17th century. It's something that happens in contemporary America and so forth. It's an eternal pattern. And Griffith actually says this quite explicitly. The image of the rocking of the baby in the cradle indicates this. Right? Every generation repeats the pattern of this split between rich and poor and the abuse of the poor by the rich. Eisenstein's critique of this is that it is precisely that. It's that it treats the relationship between rich and poor as historically invariable, as a relationship that we always have with us that has no real origin and no real development. It simply repeats itself from historical time period to historical time period. Now, as a Marxist, Eisenstein rejects this. He says that what we have to do is grasp not relations between rich and poor, described that way, but relations between capitalists and workers, or between those who own the means of production and those who work for them, in whatever time period we're in. Now, prior to capitalism in Europe, there were relations between lords and serfs, or between lords and, or between masters and journeymen and guilds and so forth. In capitalism, which begins and really takes off with the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, the primary relationship becomes one between workers and who do not possess the means of production, and those they must work for because they're the ones who do possess the means of production. Marx, for example, talks about the fact that capitalism is not possible until peasants are thrown off the land, until they have to stream into the cities, until they're in a position of no longer possessing their means of livelihood. They no longer have possession of the land. They can't grow food for themselves. They can't support themselves. The only thing they have left is their labor, which they must sell to an owner who possesses factory materials, machines, and so forth. And we get a relationship not of simple eternal division between rich and poor, but we have a relationship of class conflict that is part of a larger social and economic system, and that has a certain dynamic to it, a certain tension that moves in a particular direction. Now, of course, the direction that Eisenstein was thinking of during this time period was that of the socialist revolution. The idea was that the exploitation of workers by capitalists would mass workers together in factories, subject them to the same conditions of oppression, and also enable them to communicate with one another and to organize. And since the factories of industrializing Russia or any other industrializing nation are the centers of the economic system, workers are able to strike and to materially affect the continuing existence of the system. Now, there are, it's not just strikes, but they're able to form political parties, they're able to form revolutionary political parties, and such was the Bolshevik Party in Russia in 1917. What we have here is a dialectical concept of montage rather than an organic concept of montage. In his writings, Eisenstein explores this in great depth. So every part of Eisenstein's filmmaking involves the splitting of the original whole. Whatever it is that he's talking about, whatever it is that he's depicting, it involves the splitting of the whole into two parts. But the parts are in opposition to one another. They don't simply run parallel to one another. They're engaged in a struggle with one another that has a particular kind of dynamic. We can see this very clearly in the Odessa step sequence, because the step sequence begins with a rather idyllic, holiday-ish opening. The people of Odessa have come down to the wharf, to the water's edge, to greet the battleship Potemkin, and they send out boats with food and with flowers and so forth for the sailors. The sailors are waving to the people on shore, and so we have this kind of this social whole that involves the people of Odessa on the land and the sailors on the ship in the sea. And then what we see is from a perspective behind the assembled crowd, what we see is the beginnings of a march of Soviet guards, of armed guards, of military march in formation. And the march proceeds down the Odessa steps. Now, the people are arrayed they're on the shoreline, but they also occupy the steps, right? So they're able to see the ship over the heads of other people. And so the soldiers march down the steps and they begin firing into the crowd. What's happened here? What's happened is that the original whole has split into two antagonistic parts. One part is the people of Odessa who are on the steps watching and greeting the ship. But the other part is now the soldiers who are marching down the steps and firing at the crowd. See, unlike in Griffith's film, we don't have parallel montage. We have a montage of opposition. The two elements are engaged in struggle with one another. And so we see the slaughter of the people on the Odessa steps. This is filmed in one of the most brilliant montage sequences in film history. And as I said, it's been watched and discussed thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times, undoubtedly, in film classes around the world. And so you have to actually watch it to see exactly how complex the montage is. The central social theme of the opposition, the struggle between the people and the military, is reflected in other montage elements. For example, Eisenstein draws a distinction between the light areas and the dark areas that are depicted in each frame, between the horizontal portions of the step and the horizontal portions of the step and the vertical portions of the step, between shadow and, I think we already basically said this, between shadow and light, between people who are standing and people who are lying down because they've been shot. In other words, every scene, even if you freeze a frame, every scene has dynamic montage elements in it, all of which add up to and contribute to this sense of a dynamic conflict, a conflict that is heading in a particular direction. Well, what happens in the Odessa steppe sequence is after this very excruciating and brutal slaughter of people on the Odessa steppes, the battleship Potemkin responds. And it responds by shelling a museum, the Heritage Museum, which is kind of a center, cultural center of the Tsarist regime. And of course, it's also shelling the military. And so the attack on the people gets a response, and the response is an attack by the ship, by the military wing of the 1905 revolution, by the sailors who have rebelled and who have joined the people, who have joined the workers' strikes and so forth, have become a part of the revolutionary force. There's a great montage element toward the end of the Odessa steppes sequence, which many people miss. And that is, there's a close-up of the Heritage Museum that the ship is going to shell. And what we see is three stone lions. And one lion is in a lying position. Another lion is in a crouching position. And the third lion is in a standing position. And the way that Eisenstein films this is that we see in the first element of the montage, we see a frame of the lion in the lying position, and in the second one, we see the lion crouching, and in the third one, we see the lion fully standing. Now, what's he doing here? What he's showing is that through this visual image, that the people of Odessa, and by implication, the people of Russia in general, have awakened. You know, they're no longer asleep. They're no longer simply accepting the brutal conditions that they live under, whether it's in the countryside as peasants. You know, remember, Russia liberated its serfs only in the 19th century, in the relatively late 19th century. The landed aristocracy still had a great deal of power in the Russian government. The church organization, the Orthodox Church, had seats reserved for it in the Russian parliament, the Russian legislative assembly. And Russia was probably the most if you want to put it this way, it was the most backward part of Europe. It was never fully European anyway. It was half European and half Asian. But it was also a place in which there was a dynamic element introduced by the rise of industry. So in this nation, which had only recently abolished serfdom, there were the most advanced metalworking factories in the world, the Putilov metalworks in Petrograd. And so you had the beginnings of a large-scale Russian working class and a rebellious working class developing in a backward country. And it was this clash of two diametrically opposed entities or processes or aspects. This ancient Russia still has an aristocracy that's just a few years away from serfdom and so forth, and then the modern Russia that is industrializing, that's developing not just industry in general, but the biggest and most modern industrial plants, and that is beginning to hire people who came from the countryside, moved into the cities, and is accumulating this enormous working class, which is only at most a few years out of the countryside. And so not used to the rhythms of industrial life, and more likely to rebel under industrial conditions than perhaps countries with older working classes, as such, England and so forth. And so all these tensions, and then the tension between the Tsar's involvement in the war and the people's desire for peace and so forth, between the opulence of the aristocracy, which is shown by the officer cast on board the Potemkin, and the poverty and hunger of the population, which is represented by the sailors who are made to eat a maggot-infested side of beef and so forth. All of this shows us the development of a dynamic relationship between aspects, heading toward a period, a point of, can I put it, a point of no return, a point of crisis, not an endless replication of a pattern, but a point of crisis that requires a resolution. Or another way of putting it is to say a point of explosion. Right? These diametrically opposed forces in conflict are going to lead to an explosion. And that explosion ultimately, in Eisenstein's view, is the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917. This is what the Soviets at the time called dialectic. Right? The idea of dialectic is that reality is not a seamless organic whole, that the organic whole breaks down into two. One becomes two. And the two parts, although they imply one another, they're in contradiction with one another. And that the only way to resolve this contradiction is through a qualitative leap into something new. So you have an accumulation of tensions that lead to an explosion, and the explosion leads to a leap into something novel. Not the reproduction of an eternal pattern, but the leap into something novel. The something novel here is the Soviet regime. In other words, the attempt to build socialism in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Right? Battleship Potemkin as a film brings us back to the 1905 rebellion, because here we see the dynamic forces in opposition leading to that moment of explosion. And visually in the Odessa steppe scene, of course, this is indicated by the sailors shelling the soldiers, of course, slaughtering the people on the Odessa steppes, but also the shells landing near the Heritage Museum and the Lion awakening. The way the film ends, by the way, is the ship has to set sail again, and they have to make their way past the Admiralty fleet. In other words, past the official navy of the Tsar. And so there are tense moments in which, once again, we see this montage of opposition. It goes from the sailors on the Odessa steppe, on the battleship Potemkin, to the sailors on the Tsar's fleet, and we have a great buildup of tension. And then there's a kind of recognition between the sailors on both ships of a solidarity that connects them, of the fact that they're the same. They're peasants ripped out of the Russian countryside and subjected to the often brutal authority of the officer caste, which is the aristocratic class in Russia. And so the sailors on the admirals in the admiral's fleet allow the battleship Potemkin free passage. And so they pass through the fleet, and then in the final scene, we see the sailors on board throwing their hats up in the air and celebrating this liberating passage. And then on screen, the film ends by the titles on screen, which tell us that the battleship Potemkin, the uprising of the Potemkin, actually it's a quote from Lenin that says that was the beginning of the development of the military force of the Russian working class and the Russian peasantry. In other words, it was the beginning of the armed rebellion that in 1917 would bear fruit in the form of the October Revolution. Historically, if you look at what happened, the uprising of the sailors was a failure. The 1905 revolution was defeated by the Tsar, and the sailors many of them were hanged for their role in the uprising. None of this is depicted in the film, And what the film shows is the passage of the Potemkin through the admiral's fleet. And of course, this is an anticipation of the 1917 October Rebellion, in which the Tsar's troops will come over to the side of the Bolshevik revolution, and that will be the beginning of the socialist period in Russia. What very famous historical event during 1907 was the storming of the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace was the Tsar's headquarters. The Tsar had already been deposed. Kerensky's government was housed in the Winter Palace. But when the Bolsheviks set siege to the Winter Palace, so many military people from the Tsar's regime had already defected, had already gone over to the side of the Bolsheviks, that the Winter Palace was successfully taken by the revolutionary forces without a single person being killed. That's how hollow the regime had become. Well, okay. What Deleuze has done is he has shown us by analyzing in depth Eisenstein's work, the development of a new kind of montage. Not an American organic montage, but a Soviet dialectical montage, a revolutionary montage. But he doesn't just do that. He tells us that Eisenstein's montage was not the only one available during this period of time. That, in fact, there were 4 great Soviet montage filmmakers: Eisenstein, Potemkin, Dovzhenko, and Vertov. And he analyzes the work of all 4. And he shows the way in which the montage technique of each of the 4 directors emphasizes a particular aspect of dialectical development and transformation. Bye-bye, James. It was good having you. You'll be able to see the rest of this if you want on YouTube, because it is streaming live into it, and it'll be archived there.
I watched the Battleship Potemkin. It was very interesting.
Yeah, great.
And the man with the movie camera.
Fantastic. Okay.
What should I watch for next week?
Well, it's on the website. You'll see it. What is it? We're going to be watching The Passion of Joan of Arc by Dreyer. Okay?
Okay.
Right, we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Right. By the way, if you have the opportunity, it really pays to watch the films of the other 3 Soviet directors as well. They're all masters of cinema. And Hollywood recognizes this. Actually, Potemkin wrote a book on filmmaking, which Hollywood studios adopted as a kind of technical manual. And the book, it was called Directing for the Films, or Directing for Cinema. And not only did the Hollywood studios use it as a manual, but film schools throughout the United States used it as a basic textbook. This is a Soviet director. Well, what Deleuze does is he shows the way in which the different montage techniques of the 4 directors emphasize different aspects of dialectical development. Let me give you one example here, and that is the work of Potemkin. And Potemkin made a trilogy of films that are quite famous. The films are, let's see, Mother, Storm Over Asia, and The End of St. Petersburg. Mother, Storm Over Asia, and The End of St. Petersburg. And in each of the films, his theme is the transition from one state to another, the leap into the novel. One of the aspects of dialectical theory is that quantitative change, slow accumulative change over time, leads to a point in which it can go no further. and that in order to advance, instead of quantitative change, slow quantitative accumulative change, we have a leap into a new qualitative condition. So this generally goes under the title of, quantity gives rise to quality. And in each of Potemkin's films, what he shows is the awakening, the awakening of the consciousness of the central character in each movie. So in Mother, the central character is a mother of a young revolutionary, actually not even a revolutionary, but someone who participates in a strike, but is then arrested by the regime and imprisoned. And the mother, what we see at the beginning of the film, the mother is dominated by her husband, who is a brutal, drunken worker at the same factory where the son works. But the husband is in the employ of what was then called the Black 100s. The Black 100s were a group of thugs who operated on behalf of factory owners and landlords and so forth, and in order to keep down rebellion. And so there's a conflict between the son and the father. Father is abusive to the wife, to Mother, and she accepts it. She accepts her lot as the lot of Russian women, especially the lot of lower class Russian women. And then as the film develops, her son is pursued by the police, who come to his house and who claim that if he simply turns over literature that he has been distributing, that they'll let him go. And the mother believes the police, and so she shows them where the literature is hidden under a floorboard in the living room. And so they find the literature and they take it, and they arrest the son, and the son is tried, and he goes to prison. And of course, the mother is distraught and depressed and so forth over the part that she's played in the imprisonment of her son. But she begins to visit him in jail. She begins to carry messages in jail from his comrades who are still on the outside. And she becomes incorporated into the underground workers movement that led the strike that the son was arrested for participating in. And so she makes her transition from that of the browbeaten Russian woman to the liberated woman of the revolutionary period. And there, at the very conclusion of the film, the workers march on May Day, and they march on the prison where the son is being held. And the march coincides with a prisoner's rebellion that releases the son. But the son is shot to death by the prison guards. And the military is called out, and the military begins firing on the assembled crowd of workers, just like in the Odessa Steppe sequence. But a worker who has a red flag is shot, and the red flag falls in the street. In the very last scene, we see that Mother turns her head in the direction of the fallen comrade, goes to him, and picks up the flag and holds it aloft. And then she is shot and falls to the ground dead. Well, it's similar in some ways to the Odessa Steppe sequence. But what the film is about is the transition in the qualitative state of consciousness of the central character. The buildup of oppression, which finally comes to a head. I mean, she's beaten by her husband. Her son is exploited by the factory owner. The husband is becomes a brute under the influence of the factory owner. The son rebels. She believes the authorities. She believes what she's been taught about the police and so forth. She's betrayed as her son is betrayed by them. And her consciousness, she wakes up. She makes a transition from accepting the conditions of the old regime to rejecting them, to the desire to revolutionize them and to participate with other people in doing so. Each of the three films that is part of Pudovkin's trilogy is similar in that respect. I would recommend to you just in general that you see Storm Over Asia, which is an absolutely wonderful film that Pudovkin made, which is about a similar transition in consciousness, but this time it concerns not a working class woman and not a working class man, which is the theme of the end of St. Petersburg, but a nomadic Mongolian in eastern Russia, in far eastern Russia. And so what we see here is a similar transition from the mind of a trader, of a native Mongolian nomadic trader, to that of a revolutionary. And in the process of making this transition, the central character is identified by the British who are occupying Mongolia during the Civil War, during the Russian Civil War. He's identified as a descendant of Genghis Khan, and he's placed as a puppet on the throne. But I won't go any further because you should watch the film yourself. But you get the idea, right? That what Pudovkin is interested in is the moment of the qualitative leap, the transition from quantity to quality, as embodied in the emergence of a new state of consciousness. And once again, this is very different than Griffith's parallel montage because it leads to novelty, not to the repetition of the same old pattern, but to something fundamentally new. In this case, a new state of conscious awareness. Dovzhenko is, his films are poetic. They're poetic, they're painterly. Dovzhenko began as a painter. He influenced the great Russian filmmaker Tarkovsky, whose film Mirror we're going to see in this class. Dovzhenko's, probably his most famous work is a film called Earth, which is a wonderful film. It takes place in the Soviet countryside during the early stages in the development of collective agriculture. But the topic of Earth, the theme of Earth, is not so much the transformation of the countryside, the introduction of a tractor and the beginnings of a modernized method of production and the emergence of a collective farm and so forth. It's really about the relationship between people and the Earth, between the individual organisms that the Earth produces, including the human species, and the Earth as a great body that sustains them. And so the film begins with the funeral of the central character's grandfather. And the grandfather is lying on the ground in an orchard, surrounded by fruit. His family is assembled around him. And in addition to the adults, there are two very small children, about 3 or 4 years old. And the grandfather has a smile on his face. And his grandson, who is the central character in the movie, talks about the fact that the grandfather plowed the land every day his whole life, from his early youth until his death. 70 years of plowing the land with a hand-drawn plow, a hand-operated plow. The film is about the introduction of a tractor into this farming community. But the grandfather is not beaten. The grandfather is someone who has a direct relationship to the land, and not just to the land, but to the new generations that are being born from the land. So as the grandfather is dying, the montage goes from images of him to images of the 2-3-year-old children who are playing with one another, who are sort of mock fighting with one another, who are eating apples. There are apples and melons all around. The grandfather sits up and asks for a pear. Pear is his favorite fruit. And so one of the members of the family gives him his pear. And he eats his pear, and he says, well, now it's time to die. And he dies with a smile on his face. And so what we get here is this idea that, that the human race is a different kind of species. It's a technological species. It's going to introduce a tractor into this old agricultural world. And the tractor is going to revolutionize farming. It's going to, in the end of the film, the central character is shot one day while he's dancing, a beautiful dance, down an isolated country road in this farming community. And the son of one of the richer families who objects to the tractor because the tractor is bringing independence to the poorer farmers and taking their social status of the rich family away. One of the sons of the rich family shoots the main character as he's dancing and kills him. And there's a funeral at the end in which one of the young comrades of the now dead central character is delivering a eulogy. And he refers to the tractor as a great iron steed. And he points overhead to a plane that's flying as a great artificial bird that is going to carry the revolution to the four corners of the earth. And so there's a technological transformation in the film. People are technological beings. They're not simply parts of nature. Their ability to work and to master the natural world is what distinguishes them from other animals. And yet they never, even though that's the case, they never leave their origins. They remain a part of the natural world. They're born, they grow old, they die. They become, they go from 3-year-old children to grandfathers on their deathbeds. The film shows that there are these great organic cycles that they're transformed by human technology, but they're never abolished by human technology. There's a continuity between people and nature. And the depiction of this continuity involves some of the most beautiful images in film. Toward the end of the film, after the hero has been killed, and after the funeral of the hero has taken place, the camera shoots in an orchard. And what we see is that it's harvest time. So there are apples and pears, but also very large melons that have fallen to the ground. And it begins to rain. And so what we see is, first of all, we know that it's raining because the fruit, the camera does a close-up on the fruit, and we begin to see the fruit getting wet. The fruit begins to drip with water. And then the camera backs up and it takes in the entire scene, and it's only at that point that we see lines of rain coming down on the fruit. And then the image of the rain changes. So it originally speeds up, and then it slows down until the storm ends. And then the camera goes to the boughs of the fruit trees, and we see raindrops that are sort of hanging off the boughs and who just about to liberate themselves from their rootage in the boughs and so forth. And so what the film shows here is, once again, this notion that underneath it all, underneath the whole historical drama of human beings and the technological drama of human beings, we've got this continuing connection with the cycles of the earth. The fruit ripens and falls to the floor. It's harvested and eaten, or it disintegrates and it goes to seed, and so on. And human beings play their role in this larger process. By the way, Dovzhenko, like the other Soviet montage filmmakers was persecuted by the Stalinist regime. What happened was when Stalin came to power, when he defeated his opponents and centralized power in his own hands and created the very repressive state apparatus, the bureaucratic state apparatus in Russia, the artists' independence was stripped from them. In the early part of the revolution, there were independent artists' organizations, there were controversies, filmmakers. It wasn't that they were completely free, but there was a great deal of freedom within the context of early Soviet filmmaking, and that came to an end, in particular through the creation of official artist organizations that were incorporated into the state apparatus. And so you couldn't practice the arts unless you were a member of those organizations. And in order to be a member in good standing, you had to conform ideologically to the demands of the regime. And so this great avant-garde period in Soviet filmmaking came to a crashing halt with the rise of Stalin and with the emergence of the orthodoxy of what came to be called socialist realism, in which avant-garde experimentation was simply not tolerated any longer. Stalin himself, by the way, loved Hollywood musicals. Hollywood musicals were his favorite form of filmmaking, and he encouraged Soviet filmmakers to make similar kinds of movies. And why? Because the key thing was to depict the Russian people as happy, as happily building the new Soviet society. And so a lot of the conventions of traditional Hollywood filmmaking were taken over by the Soviets at this point. Okay, all right. So we've talked about Eisenstein, Potemkin, and Dovzhenko. Let's talk about Vertov now, because Vertov is the fourth great Soviet avant-garde filmmaker, the fourth great montage artist. I remember I told you that Vertov also began working on agitprop trains during the Russian Civil War, but that right from the beginning, Vertov's interest was in filmmaking. And Vertov was actually part of a group of three people. The other two people were his brother and the woman who became his wife. She started out, Elizabeth, she started out as his editor, as his film editor. And she continued to edit his film throughout the course of his life. In the very early period, he was making newsreel footage. And so he was in the agitprop train, in villages near the front lines. He filmed the electrification of a village. He filmed the religious ceremonies that were taking place in villages. He filmed scenes from the Civil War and so forth, and sent the footage back to Moscow, and the footage was edited. He began a series of films called the Kino Eye series. Well, in any event, he began to develop an approach to filmmaking and a theory of filmmaking that was, in a sense, the diametrical opposite of that of Eisenstein. And there was a great battle between Vertov and Eisenstein over what Soviet filmmaking ought to be. You've watched Man with a Movie Camera, and you've gotten, I think, some idea of how unique Vertov's filmmaking methods are. Vertov, first of all, there are no actors in Vertov's films. Vertov argued that cinema was a new art form that had to radically distinguish itself from theater. That just as every new art form has to liberate itself from its predecessors, cinema had to liberate itself from theater. And of course, Eisenstein was a man of the theater, and so theatrical technique carries over into his films. Vertov says this is reactionary, and this does not take advantage of the unique characteristics of cinema. So first of all, we're not going to have any actors. We're going to film ordinary people. But doing what? Well, we're going to film ordinary people in the course of their everyday lives. Vertov is one of the great documentarians. And Vertov, to some extent, is, well, there were two really great Soviet documentarians. Well, let's stick with Vertov for a moment, though. But the style of documentary that Vertov practices is very different than documentary films that we're now familiar with. And why is it? Well, first of all, Vertov is using the most advanced montage techniques imaginable. For example, he is shooting from very unusual angles, very unusual vantage points. He goes to great lengths to put the camera in places that it does not normally occupy. So there's a scene, I'm sure you remember it, from Man with a Movie Camera, where his cameraman, who is his brother, by the way, buries the camera in a hole in the ground on the tracks of a train, on railroad tracks. So he digs a hole in railroad tracks and buries the camera in the hole, and then the train comes along the tracks so that the camera is set on automatic, obviously. It's filming. And so what you get is a film of the train from its underside. Right? In other words, it's an object of everyday life, a train, but it's a train that is turned into a kind of a strange object. And we see it in a way that no one has ever seen a train before. We see the train from the underside of the train. And so Vertov is constantly doing this. He takes ordinary life, and by using avant-garde film technique, he shows it as though it had never been seen before, as though we're seeing it for the first time, or as though we're seeing it through the eyes of a different species. The film begins, besides that wonderful segment in which the theater audience assembles, and the director, the projectionist rather, lights the projection element, and we see the seats in the theater automatically go down without anybody putting them down, and so on. In other words, he depicts the theater as a kind of machine. And the projector is a machine, but the theater is a machine as well. From that scene, the film proper begins, and we see it being screened in the theater that's depicted in the movie itself. So what do we see there? Well, the film takes us to the streets of a non-identified Russian city. Actually, Vertov filmed in 3 different Russian cities and presented them as aspects of a single city. But the film is presumably 24 hours in the life of a city. But the day begins at 4 or 5 in the morning. And what do we see? Well, we see homeless people sprawled on the streets and on the benches. Now, this could not have been a very happy image for the Soviet authorities. You know, this, after all, Russia was a workers' republic, and here we have the homeless. Vertov spares no one. You know, he's absolutely uncowed in what he films and how he films it. But one of the great innovations of Man with a Movie Camera, of course, and it's been said many times, is that the central character in the movie is the movie camera. It's the movie camera itself. It is the machine that extends human vision, that brings it places that it would not normally, where it would not normally be found, you know, to the underside of a train, or to the top of a very high tower. You know, we see the cameraman, Vertov's brother, climbing up this enormous tower and setting his camera up and filming the city from above. we see the camera. It's a technique that Orson Welles will later use in Citizen Kane. The camera, the view of the camera, moves through the wall of a building in order to take us to a scene of a woman getting up, waking up in the morning, and getting ready for work. It takes us to places where normal human vision does not go. And of course, it's able to do other things. It's able to isolate the motions of athletes. So we begin to see, precisely how the human body moves when it is engaged in strenuous athletic events. It focuses on, there's so many ways in which the camera is the central entity. But the primary method that Vertov uses is he uses two cameras. There's his brother, who is the cinematographer in the film, and there is Vertov, who has his own camera trained on his brother. So we see the film footage that the brother has taken, but then we also see Vertov's footage of his brother taking the footage. In other words, the brother and the brother's camera is incorporated into the film. It's no longer the invisible eye. It's no longer the vantage point from which things are seen. It's also the thing that's seen itself. And this happens many times through the film. And we get this idea that what Vertov is after is something like total visibility. Nothing should be invisible. Not the camera, not the cameraman. And Vertov, by the way, is also filmed by the brother. And we see Vertov in the movie briefly. And so nothing escapes the camera eye. And then there's the issue of tempo. Because Russia is urbanizing, and it's industrializing, and as in all urbanizing cities and cultures, the tempo of life is speeding up. And so the tempo in the film begins slowly. It begins with people awakening, and the homeless sprawled on benches or on streets or on sidewalks or whatnot. But then as the film goes on, the tempo increases. It becomes faster and faster. I think I told you last week that the first time I saw a man with a movie camera, by the end of the film, I literally felt exhausted. I felt that I had been caught up in this incredible rush of activity. Well, a couple of points to make about this. One is that the battle between Eisenstein and Vertov was matched by Eisenstein. In other words, Vertov's criticisms of Eisenstein found their match in Eisenstein's criticisms of Vertov. And what Eisenstein criticized Vertov for was what he called impressionism. And think about the impressionist paintings of the French 19th century. Degas. Pissarro, Manet, Monet, and so forth. Degas. And what do we see here? What we see is the tendency of the painted image to break up into colors, into the tendency of colored objects to become patches of color. What people find so attractive about Impressionist painting is that they can become lost in it. They can become sensorially lost in it. It's a feast for the eyes. When you see Monet's water lilies, if you see the panels, the gigantic panels, I think they're still at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's an amazing experience. You're surrounded by color, and the colors that become more or less detached from the objects and so forth. It's an immediate sensory immersion. This is what Eisenstein objected to about Vertov's filmmaking. He says Vertov's filmmaking is impressionist. It plunges us into this orgy of sensation, but the sensations don't go anywhere. They're not structured. They don't have any lessons to teach. they have an immediacy about them, which can be compelling, but they don't have any point. And so, life as it is. I'm reading Pixel's comment here. Life as it is, the shots in general of everyday life from various perspectives. Life in the film, shots of the cameraman and camera's presence of the film, life of film, obvious effects, the still shots, the woman editing the shots and cutting back and forth from the still to the moving image. All this is very perceptive and very true of Vertov's work. But Eisenstein, Vertov's theory, by the way, and he wrote manifestos and so forth. He called himself, his wife, and his brother the Committee of Three. The Committee of Three. And the Committee of Three issued manifestos about their filmmaking. Now, the manifesto, by the way, Pixels, it was not just a political form. It was the primary way into which new movements in the arts announced themselves. So the Surrealists wrote manifestos. The Futurists wrote manifestos. The Committee of Three wrote manifestos. And in the manifestos that they wrote, they developed this notion of the kino eye. The kino eye. Kino is Russian for cinema, and so we could translate it simply as the cinema eye. In his writings, Vertov talks about the fact that the cinema eye is a mechanical eye that extends the capacity of human vision, that makes it mobile, that allows it to occupy, as Deleuze is going to say, any point whatsoever. And I'm sorry, Mac, can you speak? I'm sorry, I've just been talking.
Sure. Well, I'm just thinking that from Eisenstein's point of view, Vertov isn't really a revolutionary filmmaker, perhaps. Is that? I mean,
I think that they each accuse the other of not being revolutionary enough. Okay. They each hurl at the other the great curse of the period. They don't actually call each other counter-revolutionary, but the suggestion is that that each of them make is that the other does not take advantage of the true revolutionary potential of cinema. Okay. Now, remember the montage of attractions in Eisenstein, right? And that image in the theater of the firecrackers being set under the seats of the audience. What Eisenstein wanted to do was to create a sequence of emotions. His notion was that it was possible to classify emotions and to link them to particular visual and oral, in the case of theater oral, auditory techniques. And his notion was that the goal of the filmmaker is to create a particular, is to lead the audience from where they begin in terms of their conscious awareness to where the filmmaker wants the audience to be. And in the case of Eisenstein, of course, where Eisenstein wanted the audience to be was in a position of commitment to the revolution. So there's no doubt that Eisenstein's films are manipulative. He does this through montage, but he also does it through the use of actors. There are actors in his films, professional actors. No one ever comes to play the kind of role that's played by the lead actor in a Hollywood film, but nonetheless, the power of the actors and their facial expressions and so forth are all important. And the narrative structure of his films is also important. His films, after all, tell a story, right? Battleship Potemkin tells the story of the mutiny on the battleship and the confrontation with the Tsar's military in Odessa, and then the passage of the ship through the admiral's fleet and so forth. It tells a story. It's got a narrative structure. None of this is true of Vertov's movies. They're not narrative. They don't have actors, and they don't. There's no attempt to manipulate emotion in the way that that Eisenstein does. Eisenstein, in a very famous polemic, wrote about Vertov, and he said, what film needs is not a cinema eye. What film needs is a cinema fist. Right? A cinema fist. He says that the role of the director is to plow the psyche of the film audience. It's to plow the psyche of the film audience. You have to remember, Russia just emerged from a civil war. It would face the rise of the Nazis in Germany, and it would be plunged into the Second World War in fairly short order. The Battleship Potemkin is made in 1925. By 1935, Hitler is in power in Russia 10 years later, and is beginning to threaten, the Soviet Union, and eventually there'll be a great global conflagration. So when Eisenstein says that what we need is a cinema fist, and that what we need to do is plow the psyches of the cinema audience, he's serious about it. This is a period of intense struggle, intense collective violence on all sides. And so he sees Vertov as having abandoned that for this ephemeral project of immersing people in the stream of sensation. Right. Let me read what Pixels is saying. He says he uses that image in the film, the eye and the camera lens. Now that's Vertov. The Odessa steps scenes with the child being trampled and the baby in the carriage, very manipulative. Absolutely. Absolutely. The point is to get us to identify with the mother, who is trying to save her child, and of course to hate the Tsar's military, who kills the mother, and then the child. It makes it such that the child is trampled by the people on the steps. Yeah, there's no more manipulative scene in cinema than that. In the Vertov scene, the woman shooting at the targets, one of them shows the Nazi insignia. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's also true that Vertov sees his filmmaking as in service of the revolution. See, he denies the charges that Eisenstein levels against him. But this is what Vertov's framework is. And I think it's actually, when you really look at Vertov's writings, he actually develops, although he doesn't have the intellectual reach or the power of expression that Eisenstein had. Nonetheless, his ideas are fascinating and unique. What emerges from Vertov's writings is that Russia, in the process of being industrialized, has to acquire new faculties of sensation, new faculties of perception. Because what happens in the industrialization process? Well, what happens is, first of all, factories are created in urban centers. And the factories draw people from the countryside. So you have a huge migration from the countryside into the cities. And the people in the cities have to adapt to a different pace of life. When they're farmers or when they're peasants, they guide their lives by the great cycles of nature. Right? There's the seasonal progression. There's a time to sow and a time to reap, as the what is it, Ecclesiastes? One of the books of the Bible says, time to sow and a time to reap. The days, you get up with the sun and you go to bed as the sun goes down and so forth. But you move into the city, and now you have to respond to the factory whistle. You've got to deal with the frenetic motion of people in the streets. You've got to adapt to the fact that there are vehicles driving now in the streets, that you can be run over and killed by a car, even in Russia during this period of time. And you also, of course, have to adapt to the machinery that exists in factories, on construction sites now. Machines begin to proliferate in Russia. And people are now working in relation to machines. They need to incorporate themselves into the rhythms and the motion of machines. In all of Vertov's films, He's fascinated by machines and by the movement of machine parts. And this is one of the reasons why the camera becomes the central character in Man with a Movie Camera. The camera is an archetypal machine. And so what we get by reading Vertov is this notion that people are not equipped at first. Their sensory mechanisms are tuned to a different channel. They're not equipped to understand or to be oriented in this welter of new sensations that comes at them from every direction in an urban industrial society. So what's the point of the film, of filmmaking? Well, the point of filmmaking is not to replicate that. It's to show it to us from an analytic perspective. In other words, the role of the camera is to analyze this new welter of sensations. It's to show us the various aspects of it. It's to show us the role that machines are playing, the way in which people's lives are beginning to change, the correlation between new sensations and new methods of production or new ways of living. You know, Vertov's notion is that the camera and the cameraman, or the camera operator, can begin to develop through the kino eye, through the mechanical eye that can go places that the human eye cannot, and that can see things that the human eye can't see, from perspectives that the human eye never occupies. That the purpose of cinema, of filmmaking now, is to create a new sensory apparatus that's equal to the new world that people are living in. Vertov also says in one of his writings, he says, what I want to do is to get people to the point, in particular to get workers to the point where they love their workbenches. In some ways, and that, by the way, that doesn't mean, in Vertov's case, to manipulate them, at least not in the way that Eisenstein does. What it means is that people must enter into a new symbiotic relationship with their machines. In other words, people are not, we're not artisans anymore, and we're not farmers anymore. We're living in an industrial society in which we're coupled with machines, whether it's machines that transport us places or machines that are present at work or whatnot. And for Vertov, it's no longer the human being in isolation. It's the human being as paired with machines. And so he talks about, in one of his articles, he talks about the genesis of the new electric man, the new electric man. Does that make the machine the leader of the revolution? Yeah, in a way it does. And you're right, Pixels. He shows a lot of shots with people interacting with machines, you know, the phone operators, the seamstresses, in Man with a Movie Camera. If you watch his other films, if you watch, for example, 1/6 of the Earth, you'll see images of machines that are far more. He goes into mines to show us mining machinery. He goes into factories and so forth, and begins to show us the components of machines and how they move. And Eisenstein also criticized him for that. And he criticizes Vertov for a cult of machinery and for an impressionistic method of filmmaking. But from Vertov's perspective, it's necessary to create a new sensational apparatus for people that takes care of the charge of impressionism, but it's also necessary to get people to see the beauty in machines. He found machine motion to be beautiful, and to understand that their own creative capacities are now linked with machines, that there are machine-human pairs. The scene in Man with a Movie Camera of people participating in athletic events is more significant than it appears to be at first. Because the purpose of athletics, in the eyes of Vertov, is to train people in leaving the more organic motions that are appropriate in the countryside and beginning to adapt emotions that are machine-like in a very specific sense. motions that have precision, motions that are geared toward the accomplishment of precise goals. At one point in one of his manifestos, he says, people are physically inept, that they lack the precision of machine motion, that we must essentially embargo them for a while. We're not going to make films about them for a while. We're going to focus simply on machines. He never did that, by the way. And he always has people in his films. He's always filming human events and human sequences. But he makes a point here, namely that there needs to be a new. And the reason why I say there's something contemporary about that. There's a movement that's called transhumanism, and that looks forward to the development of artificial intelligence, that talks about the fact that now people are coupled with their computers. And of course, computer is a more abstract kind of machine, but it's certainly a machine. Matter of fact, the mathematical paper that the modern architecture for computers comes from was a paper written by Alan Turing, and what it does is it describes a machine that can simulate any other machine through a particular kind of code. The computer is a kind of meta machine. Through a particular code, through a particular program, it simulates a typewriter, or it simulates a movie camera, or it simulates, you get the idea. And so what we have here now, we're all sitting, I've got this thing in my lap now, I've got the ultimate machine. And boy, is it coupled with me. It's growing out of my lap, right? Well, Vertov sees this before the computer. He sees this in the age of physical, overtly physical mechanical machines. But he's making a similar point that people are now, they now have to see themselves in relation to their machines rather than in opposition to their machines. And let me just take a look at what Pixels has written. She says, I'm the daughter of a machinist. So I grew up around a lot of machines. Yeah, my father installed machinery and serviced it in an artificial textiles factory. And he had a workshop, in our basement. And I remember sitting with him and tinkering around with things. So you and I have a connection. You grew up around a lot of machines for fine-tuning parts for the aerospace industry, the automotive industry, etc. Yeah, my father was famous for going to family parties and ending up repairing people's washing machines, their refrigerators, and so forth. What about gaseous perception? Mac asks. I'm glad you asked that, Mac. What about gaseous perception? This is Deleuze's analysis. And it really does take us to the conclusion of the perception image too. We saw last week, we watched L'Atlant. And L'Atlant, remember, is a product of what Deleuze calls the pre-war French school. And it gives us what he refers to as the liquid image, right? It focuses on people who live on the water, and it sees the water as the kind of universal medium of motion. The way that Deleuze puts this is that the purpose of Vigo, for example, and L'Atlant is to give us the abstract form of motion that connects all other forms of motion. And by placing motion on the water, this is possible. The water kind of acts as an equalizer. People and things share a pattern. If there's a wave, they're carried by the wave. If they're dragged under, they're dragged under. If they have to maintain their balance, they've got to maintain their balance and so forth. And so we get this medium of abstraction of motion. But for what purpose? Well, what Deleuze says is that what the pre-war French filmmakers are interested in, and what the liquid image is meant to do, is to evoke an experience of the whole of time. And it does it by focusing on the immensity of water. The fact that water is the medium that is, how can I put it? It's both the medium that we travel on, on the barge, but it's also the medium that forces us to move in certain ways. It's a time image. It's an image of time in its totality. But it's an image that is spiritual in character. And here, let me go back and to remind you about the structure of Bergson's work. Because Bergson tells us that that human experience has two poles. One pole, we are confined to, as close as we can get to, the instantaneous moment of the present. And in that instantaneous moment, it's as though everything were laid out on a plane, and the parts of things are arrayed alongside of one another. And the reason why this is significant is that by conceiving of the world in this way and seeing the world as an accumulation of parts that interact with one another, we are able to manipulate it in various ways. Think about a machine. Let's go back to Vertov. What is a machine? Well, a machine is a collection of parts, and each part moves in a certain fashion and has a certain relation to other parts. This is what Bergson calls matter. Matter is the world as it's seen, as close to the instantaneous moment as we can get. It's the world as laid out in space. Now, time, our experience of time, is essentially an experience of memory. Remember that image of the cone of memory that we have here. We have a cone here that intersects the plane of matter at a point, and that point is the present moment. But we also have behind that point the cone of previous experiences that have now sunken into the past. And this is what Vertov calls the dimension of the spirituality. And ultimately, if we think about the cone, the portion of the cone that is finally focused in the point, and the area of the cone that's behind it, ultimately that cone is the totality of time. It's time as a whole. Remember that image in Creative Evolution that Bergson gives us and that Deleuze repeats. We take a sugar cube and we put it in hot water, and we wait for the cube to dissolve. Well, if you want to speed up the process, Deleuze says you take a spoon and you stir the sugar cube in the hot water and it dissolves more quickly. What have you done? You've altered the configuration of elements and the motion of those elements, which introduces a qualitative change. And this also refers to the qualitative change of dialectical development, right? The qualitative change is that the water becomes sweet. Well, time is nothing but the great whole that is constantly changing its quality as the various aspects of the whole change their relationship and their configuration to one another. So what Deleuze claims is that in the liquid perception of Jean Vigo and Renoir and the other pre-war French filmmakers, what we have is the experience of water as the whole of time, as that immense whole of the spiritual dimension that is always there and that changes qualitatively depending upon the various events that are occurring in parts of it. It's the open whole. There's no limit to water, right? At least, you're out in the middle of the water, and what do you see? More and more water. It's the immense whole of time. He also compares it to the experience of the sublime in Kant's work. I won't go into that. It's the critique of judgment It's an important book in philosophical aesthetics. But the idea in general of the sublime is that we experience the sublime when we experience something that overruns our capacities. You know, we're in the presence of a gigantic mountain and something that dwarfs us. Well, we experience the sublime in the presence of that gigantic mountain. Or we're in the middle of a great hurricane. You know, we experience the sublime in the middle of the hurricane, something that vastly overruns our limitations. But that also indicates to us that we're capable in thought of overcoming our limitations and seeing things from that greater perspective. That's the role of the liquid perception, of the image of the liquid perception. Let's go to Vertov now, gaseous perception. What is Deleuze's point? Well, he begins by building on the theory of the kino eye, of the cinema eye. The cinema eye is the camera. The camera is, in principle, absolutely mobile, can go anywhere. I mean, now we've got a great camera in space. We've got several in space, but we've got a great camera orbiting the Earth, and that's focused on the depths of the universe, right? It's taken us almost 13 billion years, light years. In other words, 13 billion years into the past. We can see now through the images that the Hubble Space Telescope has captured. We can see stars as they first emerge. They first begin to form after the Big Bang, about a million years after the Big Bang. It's an amazing thing, right? Just how much the camera has extended human vision. And so Vertov's, he begins with this, with Vertov's idea of the kino eye. And so he tells us that since the camera is absolutely mobile, as I said last week, it can embed itself in any position in space. It can take up the perspective of any point in space. Well, remember what matter is for Bergson and for Deleuze. Matter is the world as it exists in this instant. If you want to put it this way, matter is what occupies space. And what's space? Well, space is a series of points, each of which is outside of the others. And so space creates this framework of extension. If the camera is able to embed itself at every point in space, if the cinema eye is able to occupy every point in space, then what it becomes is the eye of matter itself. It becomes matter, how can I put it? It becomes the perspective of the entire material world on itself. Let me see if I can make this a little more clear. Well, okay, let's focus on the aspect of why is this gaseous? Why is this gaseous rather than liquid? Liquidity is still a particular manifestation of matter. Water is matter in a particular state. And so although water is in French filmmaking, call it a symbol, although that's not a word that Deleuze is likely to use, but for our purposes it's close enough. Call water a symbol of the whole of time. A symbol of the whole of time. A symbol of the whole of the spiritual dimension of human existence. The gaseous perception moves in the opposite direction. It moves not toward the whole of time, but toward the whole of matter, which is the world as present in the current instant. In other words, the liquid perception explores the cone behind the point where the cone intersects with the plane. Vertov explores the plane. It's the plane of matter that he's interested in. And by embedding the camera in principle at every point in that plane, he gives us an image of matter from its most minute elements. And exactly. A point can relate to any other point, but also note that to embed the I in every point of space, you have to think of, I mean, imagine, it's very hard to conceptualize, but imagine all of the particles in the universe, right? And imagine that every particle in the universe, every quark, every electron, every neutron, imagine that they were all camera eyes and that they were all filming at the same time. Well, what would you see? First of all, these points are in motion. You know, they're not static. They're in motion. And matter is in motion. That's quite clear. So they're not static, they're moving around. So what you would see is an absolutely inconceivable number of tiny cameras in motion, filming every other camera in motion, every other particle in motion. And this would be multiplied by the total number of particles in the universe. In other words, you would have a perception, an experience of perception that is melted down to its most minute mobile elements. And this is what he calls gaseous perception. I think it's a brilliant observation on the part of Deleuze. It's not what occurred to Vertov, but Vertov he did conceive of himself as a materialist. And after all the Soviets thought of themselves as materialists. And by materialists, what they meant was that they were exiting the great domination of Russia by the Russian Orthodox Church. And that instead of focusing on the depths of spirit, which they regarded as hokum, basically, they were going to focus on matter as the element in which with which human beings have to grapple in the process of surviving, in the process of shaping their world technologically, and so forth. And there's a reason why Marxism at this stage was called dialectical materialism. But to add one more complication to the picture, Deleuze points out that there was always a conflict within Marxism over the meaning of dialectic. What does dialectical materialism mean? Well, for Potemkin, for Eisenstein, and for Dovzhenko, materialism, matter refers to something that is incorporated into the world of human experience. In other words, the world of matter is depicted. Think about Earth, which depicts the apple orchard and the rural farms into which the tractor is going to be introduced. It does show us the natural elements. It shows us matter as it is, but it's always matter in relation to the human being. It's always matter in relation to the peasants who occupy the land. It's matter it's the tractor as a material object, but in relation to the person who's driving the tractor. Or it's the factory that turns bread into grain, but in relation to the people in the factory, and so forth. So matter is dialectical because it's incorporated into an historically changing human community. What Deleuze points out is that this is not the conception of dialectic that Vertov has. For Vertov, matter is dialectical in itself, apart from human beings. The particles of the material world are constantly changing. They're in opposition to one another, in complementary opposition. You know, the proton has the opposite charge of the electron. It's true, they attract, but they also are forced apart from one another by the orbital motion of the electrons around the proton and so forth, and also by other forces in the nucleus. We can take a look at the dynamic relations between opposites within the material world itself. So what Vertov is interested in is not incorporating matter into the world of human beings, but incorporating human beings into the world of matter. We are material objects, just as our machines are. We are material objects that can enter into a symbiotic relationship with our machines. And so I think Deleuze is absolutely right that this is the view of matter that Vertov has. Deleuze's brilliance is in showing us that this liquid perception takes its place in a range of forms of perception that define the different phases in the early development of cinema. Whether it's the organic perception of the organic parallel montage of D.W. Griffith's work, whether it's the spirituality of the liquid perception image of the pre-war French school, or whether it's the dialectical dynamic image of the Soviet school. And then within the Soviet school, you've got a range of perception images which ultimately lead us to Vertov's gaseous perception image. It's a tour de force that Deleuze has given us. You want to say something, Mac?
Well, I think you pretty much said it all.
Let me ask you a question, because you're an art historian. Does the correspondence between Man with a Movie Camera and Impressionist painting make sense? Because this is, of course, Eisenstein's charge.
I think it kind of does, in that both are kind of making this present moment of modernism kind of the focus of their art, certainly, and of kind of what the audience response is too, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it occurs to me, too, that Impressionist painting arises in Paris when Paris is the center of the newly industrializing world. The Impressionists were painting at the same time as the great world fairs, the world expos that were beginning to be held in Paris. And what was the purpose of the expos? Well, it was to display the new mass-produced objects that machine production was creating. But also, the patterns of urban experience were changing, and the patterns of urban pleasure, of urban leisure, were changing in relation to the changing patterns of urban work. So what the Impressionists mostly portray, with the exception of Pissarro, who likes the countryside and is interested in the lives of peasants, but what most of Impressionist paintings portray is the French middle class at leisure in the city. It explores new forms of leisure, and the immersion in color is in part is sort of integrated into that experience. Well, go ahead.
As closely connected to a kind of a revolutionary movement, as you said.
That's absolutely true. It's connected to what Marx refers to as the revolutionary character of capitalism, but that's not in itself political revolution, although Paris was never far away from political revolution. After all, in 1871, we had the Paris Commune. But you're right, the Paris Commune was not directly connected with, well, it's complicated, actually, because the Paris Commune did have a role to play in the arts. And I think it had a major role to play in the transition between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And I'll tell you why, because the Commune was an uprising, for people who don't know it, of the city of Paris, and Paris was taken over by a government that represented Parisian workers and artisans. It was the first workers' government in history. It was surrounded by troops from the old French regime and ultimately crushed when they came into the city and annihilated the communards and killed thousands of them, lined them up summarily against walls and shot them. But the ones who survived, communards who survived, were sent to French penal colonies, like in French Guiana and that kind of thing. And then a few years later, under a new government, there was an amnesty granted to all communards who had been imprisoned. And so the communards returned to Paris, and a number of them moved to the suburb of Montmartre. Now, Montmartre had been a rural suburb until it became occupied by the former communards. And what many of the communards did was they created cafes. And the cafes became the centers of the avant-garde. So the very famous cafe was called Le Chat Noir, the Black Cat. This is where ultimately Picasso hung out there, but it's where the generation of post-impressionists, Gauguin, Cézanne, Rousseau, people like that, and even people like Seurat and so forth. It's where they hung out. And so in Montmartre, what you had was the development of an avant-garde in painting that was associated with the political avant-garde that had been involved in the Commune uprising. But that's post-impressionist. And so, I mean, you're absolutely right, Mac, that the Impressionists prior to this, that was not characteristic of them. But I do think that actually one of my pet theses is that the avant-garde in Western art arises through the impact of the political left on the world of the arts, and it adopts many of the forms of the political left. For example, the manifesto. It's not accidental that the manifesto becomes the central statement of new art movements, when it had been the central statement of new political movements, especially political movements of the left. But also, and we're off topic here, but let me just finish the sketch. Also, many of the people who participated in that environment in Montmartre after the Commune were anarchists. And one of the great critics, critics of art critics of the period, who was connected with all of the avant-garde painters, his name was Felix Fénéon, and he was an anarchist militant. There's evidence that he actually participated in the bombing of a bourgeois cafe in Paris. So not only were these former communards, but there was the influence of a contemporary and very militant anarchist movement that played a role in the art avant-garde. We have to remember Picasso grew up in Barcelona, which was the center of Spanish anarchism. And even though Picasso joined the French Communist Party toward the end of his life, the period of his most productive period, the period around the transition from his figurative stuff to early Cubism, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and things like that. This is a period when Picasso was still under the influence of his anarchist background and of the anarchist movement in France. So revolution has played an important role for the past couple of hundred years in ways that we might not immediately recognize. But certainly in the case of the Soviets, it was not only immediately recognized, it was constantly in mind. And so this was an art that attempted to be explicitly revolutionary, not just in aesthetic form, but in political impact. And that, I don't think that's ever been reproduced, with one possible exception, and that is during the French Rebellion in May of 1968. The great poster art that was produced during that period was being made by students of the Central Academy of the Arts in Paris, and they were certainly avant-garde artists, and their imagery was inspired by the May uprising. And then perhaps filmmaking in Latin America in the 1970s that also had a direct connection with revolutionary movements. So I guess there were three epochs, really, in which that occurred, in which the revolutionary politics and revolutionary aesthetics marched hand in hand. There's the Soviet Union, the 1880s, let's say, in Paris, the original avant-garde, and then the Latin American avant-garde, especially in cinema of the 1980s. So we've ranged far and wide in this discussion. But I think ultimately it comes back to Deleuze's treatment. Let me just say once again, point out once again that although Deleuze's book is difficult, and although it requires, like the work of any philosopher, application, although you've got to read it again and again to make sense of it, it's worth it because he has a synoptic mind, and he's able to encompass a great deal, and he's able to organize the material in ways that no one organized it before. He's able to do it in a way that illuminates the meaning in ways that was never occurred before. He's created, as far as I can see, with the exception of one or two analytic philosophers, and I tend to be not so crazy about analytic philosophy, but I won't condemn it. But with the exception of a couple of analytic philosophers, he's the only one, and then now Zizek, of course, he's the only one who's written seriously about cinema. And actually, I would include Zizek on that. I don't think Zizek writes about cinema. Zizek writes about Lacan and psychoanalysis through cinema, right? But it's not filmmaking that is Zizek's topic. It's various concepts in Lacan that he sees illustrated by filmmakers. But Deleuze is interested in filmmaking. He's a philosopher of cinema in a much more direct way, and so I think his work is extremely important and is going to remain so in the history of philosophy of cinema. So next week we are moving from the perception image into what Deleuze calls the affection image. And the film that we're going to be watching here is Theodore Dreyer's Passion of Joan of Arc. So watch the film and read the related assignment, and we'll convene again next week. Okay?
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube, and the link is from my website. So whenever you're confused about where we are, go to the website. So this would be the fourth tab from the left on the website. The first one is the syllabus, second one is perception image 1, the third one perception image 2, the fourth one is the affection image. That'll open up a page with the assignment from Deleuze, Luc Deleuze's book, and with a link to Dreyer's Passion of Joan of Arc. If I'm not mistaken, that is also free of charge. YouTube makes that available free of charge. After that, I think the films are going to become more, it'll cost you like $3.99 to watch a film, or to rent it, as they say, to rent it for 48 hours. Okay. Let's see here what Pixels has to say. Well, first of all, you asked the question: is matter limited to the tangible? In a sense, matter is limited to the physical, but clearly, if you mean by tangible what we can feel. We don't feel, at least directly, quarks or electrons or whatnot. These are presumably particles of matter that are so small that they're below the threshold of sensation. It's when they act in concert with one another, when they make up atoms and molecules and larger structures, that they become tangible in the literal sense of the word. Then you've got, for your information, the film. The Man with the Movie Camera has a couple of different links on YouTube with different soundtracks. Yeah. Once again, you see in the film a piano player and an orchestra. That's depicted in the movie, but when Man with the Movie Camera was made, there was no sound. Sound was invented, I think it was in 29 Pixels, I forget. The Jazz Singer was the first sound movie. But Vertov anticipated sound. And he wrote about sound before it became available as an actual cinematic technology. And he made one of the first sound films in which the so-called Dumboff Symphony occurs. I'm blanking on the name of the film. But he theorized sound before sound became available. And so there was no soundtrack for Man with a Movie Camera, although Man with a Movie Camera would be played in theaters, and different orchestras or piano players would play different things in the theater. There might have been some broad indications that Vertov made about the kind of music that he wanted. But now what's happened, as the film has been released and re-released and so forth, the people who do it tack a soundtrack onto it. And so the soundtracks that you're hearing are more or less foreign to what Vertov had in mind. If you don't want them on, just mute them and watch the film for its pure visual experience. And then you write, what's interesting is how those soundtracks affect the experience of the film if you compare scenes. Yeah, exactly. And so you have to see now the films that are being released as, how can I put it, they're interpretations of Vertov's film. It's not exactly the film itself. We no longer have the film itself would have been Vertov's film with Vertov in the audience in its initial showing, right? With Vertov, controlling more or less the music that was played. But it's impossible for us to reach that. So what we get now is interpretations of Vertov's film with soundtracks assigned to them, and that obviously is going to affect the way in which we perceive the film. So that is a good thing to keep in mind. And then you write this version, and then you've got the link down there. This version is also very sharp and clean visually with a different soundtrack. Okay, yeah, I'll put it on the site. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Okay, folks, Jason unfortunately didn't seem to be able to get into the session, and Lily has been working every night doing sound recording. So she was able to attend the first session of the class, but hasn't been able to rejoin us, unfortunately. But it was good having James and Mac and Pixels present in this one, and we'll see you next week. Okay? Take care, folks. Bye.